I think we're ready to proceed with the last three presentations for today. Now we have Mr. Papacostas with Camille Enlart and Saint Mamas at Morphou. Then we have two more presentations, and as before, questions and remarks will be made at the end of the three presentations. So, Mr. Papacostas, please.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. Many thanks to Rita for organizing this and to everybody else who's here. And many thanks also to Rita for securing the photographic archive for this place. It's great to have it in Cyprus rather than somewhere else. The material is of interest to us working on secret monuments, so it makes perfect sense. Okay, so I'll try to explain why the photographs that Camille Enlart took at St. Mamas are so important, even though the monument is still standing. So the case here is very different from what we've seen earlier with the Avgasida monument, the Avgasida monastery. Let me first tell you what Enlart recorded at Agios Mamas. He dedicated, in his two-volume work, he dedicated about 6 pages, 2 of them here, to this church. And then in a different chapter on the funerary monuments in Cyprus, another 2 pages on the tomb of the saint, the tomb is inside the church, as we shall see in a minute. By comparison, of course, the much more important Gothic monuments, he dedicates something like over 50 pages to the cathedral, the Latin cathedral here in Nicosia, St. Sophia. So very different scale of coverage. In terms of visual materials, what he gives is a plan, the first ever published of the church, so you can see very well the architectural type there. He also provides sketches made after his own photographs in most cases, including a sketch of the Arcosolium, the tomb of the saint, based on one of his photos, drawings of capitals, such as those over there. Now, the surviving photographs that he took, well, there are 9 of them known to me, at least. Maybe there were more which disappeared. But in the publication, in the 2 volumes on the architecture of Cyprus, he only published 1 out of those 9 photographs, showing a detail of the sculptural decoration from the Arcosolium with the saint's tomb, which was indeed the main focus of his attention. So the photographs, actually, that I will show you later on, the photographs of the monument from inside, outside, and around it remained largely unknown until recently, and they are revelatory in many respects. Now, let me first show you St. Mamas today. Well, as probably all of you know, the monument stands west of Nicosia at Morphou. It was a goal of pilgrimage, a very popular one, until 1974. Now it functions as a museum. It is a large, domed and vaulted basilica, by which I mean it has a central nave flanked by 2 aisles, separated by colonnades, arcades. It is very well preserved by comparison to other monuments of the period. And the period is the 16th century. It is a unique example of 16th century architecture, ecclesiastical architecture, that preserves its sculptural decoration in a good state, frescoes, not too many, but they are there, and especially a complete set, well, almost complete set of liturgical furnishings. There's the ciborium over the altar table, there's the iconostasis, very elaborate, with a crucifix on top, many of the original icons, probably original, and of course the tomb with its decoration. We'll look at this in a minute. So what the photographs by Camille Enlart are useful for is the subsequent history of the monument after its construction, the small alterations that happened over the centuries down to the early 20th. It's about the history of the building. Now, what do we know about the building, about this church? Well, it was founded by a wealthy Cypriot aristocrat who lived between Nicosia and Venice, well, between Cyprus and Venice. He was issued from a very prominent local family, known through the sources since at least the 16th century. Members of the family were active in public life, in the ecclesiastical affairs of Cyprus, so they come up in the sources very often in the 15th and the 16th centuries. The founder was Zenios Singlitikos. Singlitikos is the name of the family. He's attested from the very beginning of the 16th century. In 1521, he acquired the title, well, empty but honorific title of Count of Roucha or Rocca, according to the Venetian sources. In 1528, he acquired Morphou and the area in the villages around Morphou from the Venetian authorities, and he died, which explains, of course, his interest in the shrine, in the place there, and he died 10 years later in 1538. Now, how do we know all this, especially the link with St. Mamas? Through his testament. This is one page from the testament, his will, drafted in 1538, shortly before his death. And he mentions, among lots of other stipulations in the testament, several bequests to St. Mamas, to the shrine of St. Mamas, for the construction of the church and the monastery. He leaves money for daily masses, and he explains that, and that's a bit in the red rectangle there, he explains that should he die in Nicosia, he should be buried in the Latin Cathedral of St. Sophia in front of the altar of St. Mark. If he died anywhere else on Cyprus, he wishes to be buried at St. Mamas, so his foundation, in front of the image of the saint, presumably referring to the tomb, I'm not sure about that. And finally, if death found him in Venice, which is indeed what happened eventually in the summer of 1538, he wanted to be buried at the nunnery of Santa Croce della Giudecca, which is over there on the Giudecca. So that's where he was actually buried in 1538. His tomb there does not survive. So what we have here in the case of St. Mamas, the building, and the founder, is a unique example for the period, for Cyprus, of aristocratic patronage at the highest level, where we know quite a lot about the founder himself, his background, his family, his activities, and the final product surviving. The church is still there with much of its contents. I cannot stress enough how rare this is. Very often, all we have is the name of a founder with a surviving building, or lots of textual information on the founder, and the building is no longer there, or the work of art that was commissioned. So that's how this link is enacted with Mamas and Singlitiko. Now, the wider context, what is happening in this period during which Zenios Singlitiko is active on Cyprus and in Venice? Well, Cyprus is, of course, part of the Venetian possessions, the overseas possessions, as we see on the map, since, in fact, the 1470s, to all intents and purposes, since the reign of Caterina Corner. It will remain under Venetian control down to the Ottoman conquest of 1570-71. Again, this is an exceptionally well-documented period in the history of Cyprus, better than any previous period, in the sense of surviving archival material, both published and still unpublished, pilgrims' accounts, local histories, surviving monuments, epigraphy, graffiti, Gaia, frescoes, lots of them, of course, especially in the churches of the Troodos Mountains, which are neglected a bit, works of art, icons, manuscripts, all sorts of things on which to base an assessment of the sort of daily reality in Cyprus at the time. By the middle of the 16th century, so well into the Venetian period, Cyprus was the largest, the wealthiest, and the most populous of the Venetian overseas territories. Nicosia, in fact, was the largest city in the Venetian territories beyond the terraferma. But it was, of course, exposed, as the map again suggests, in the Mediterranean, surrounded by Ottoman territories. So the whole of the Mediterranean, by this point, is under Ottoman control, apart from Crete and further east, Cyprus. In terms of building activity in the same period on Cyprus, well, first of all, one has to note there is an exponential growth of the population, demographic growth. The Venetian documentation, as analyzed by Benjamin Arbel, has established that between the beginning and the end of the Venetian period, the population doubled from around 100,000 to 200,000. The population won't reach again that level until the early British period in the late 19th century. It's quite significant. It is a period of investments by great landowners like Delius and Politico in agriculture, which is what he did, like his peers at Morphou and the area around it. It's a period of growth for the cities. That's when they are, by which I mean, of course, Magus and Nicosia mainly, when these cities have their fortifications erected. Two images on the left illustrating that. There is also non-military building activity sponsored by the Venetian authorities, which is important because that served in a way as a conduit for the introduction of elements of all'antica, contemporary Renaissance Italian architecture to Cyprus. An example, the facade of the ruinous Palazzo del Capitano in Famagusta. At the same time, there are other trends in the local architecture of Cyprus. There's a lot of multiplicity, actually, of forms and styles, if I want to talk about styles, resulting in a very multifaceted architectural landscape. The ecclesiastical architecture of the cities is not particularly well known for that period, but evidence, such as that building, bottom right, suggests that a lot of inspiration was based on earlier local traditions, including Lusignan Gothic, because of the venerability of the old age of those buildings. Remember, by the 16th century, St. Sophia here in Nicosia was, 300 years old, 200 years old, something like that, a bit more actually. So that's what this facade reflects next to St. Sophia. In the countryside, where Morphou is and St. Mamas, there's something slightly different happening. There is much more continuity, as far as we can tell from the surviving monuments, with earlier traditions, by which I mean of the Byzantine period. That's quite visible. There's also increased building activity, flourishing monasteries, flourishing rural communities, villages, especially up in the Troodos mountains, in the Troodos valleys, where the timber roofed type of construction continues. This had appeared back in Byzantine times, probably in the course of the 12th century, and that's of course linked to the available building materials. In the lowlands, and that's the domain of Thomas, lots of domed churches, vaulted churches, dotting the countryside in different places. And I'm telling you all this, I'm mentioning all this wider context in order to stress how different and how exceptional St. Mamas is. It's ostentatious by comparison to all of these other monuments. It is large in scale compared to these churches. It is basilical, but different from the Gothic basilicas or the much older late antique basilicas, which were not standing by this period. So it's very special. That's why it's so important to know every possible detail about the structure and its history. Let me first explain, though, what on earth St. Mamas and his cult is doing at Morphou. Well, there are various traditions about St. Mamas and his life. He's supposed to have been a young shepherd who was martyred in the 3rd century AD in Caesarea, in Central Asia Minor. Up there on the map, should be a bit further up in the map actually. And that's where his great cult center grew in Byzantine times and was maintained down to the 11th century, down to the Seljuk occupation of those lands in the 1060s. Now, Mamas is associated with pastoral life. With the rural world, he is the protector of flocks and of shepherds. So quite appropriate for the countryside, not much of an urban sort of appeal for Mamas. The rather odd thing is that there is no clear or strong evidence for the cult of Mamas on Cyprus until the Lysian period, not earlier. And the icon you see on the left, the painted panel, is one of the earliest, showing the sort of what becomes the standard iconography of the saint, riding a lion and carrying a lamb in his arms. And that's linked to the local legend of St. Mamas, as conveyed to us in the chronicle of Leontios Macheras, the 15th century Cyprus chronicler, who tells us that Mamas lived in Alaia, so on the coast of Asia Minor, almost opposite Cyprus. He milked lions for cheese, to make cheese. Be interested to try lion cheese, lion milk cheese. After his martyrdom, his parents at Alaia placed his coffin in the sea, and it floated on the water. It arrived at the bay of Morphou, where a virtuous man saw the coffin floating on the waters, brought his oxen and his sons, and together they pulled the coffin out to take it back home. When they reached Morphou, the coffin refused to move. It became too heavy, and the oxen couldn't move any further. Now, this is an extremely common hagiographic topos, an element in these stories of saints and their relics, to explain, a very convenient way to explain actually why is the relic in this place with which the saint has nothing to do. The saint didn't live here, didn't die here. Why on earth is the relic here? This is something that goes back to to late antiquity, at least the 5th century, with the relic of Saint Minas in Egypt, where the camels cannot pull the sarcophagus any further, or the head of John the Baptist near Constantinople, the mules cannot move it any further. It has to stay there, and the church needs to be built at that point. And it has a very long history, down to the late Middle Ages. There is even the St. Henry of Finland, where it's a similar story. The oxen pulling the relic of St. Henry in Finland at some point refused to move further, exactly like in this case. So, very common. Now, the church itself, as it stands today, is not the first on the site, our 16th century church built by Zenius in Litiko. The excavations, partial excavations conducted in the 1950s inside the church, and that's what the plan shows there. Maybe I will show it on the next slide, you can see a bit better. There we are, the different phases have revealed a first late antique structure, perhaps from the 5th or 6th century, that's represented by the green part there. So you have the apse in the middle of the current nave. This is the current building around. So a basilica, presumably, which would have extended westwards. For some reason, this was replaced, probably in the early medieval period, maybe 8th century, by a very large pier basilica, of which we see the large apse here, and the piers would have been in that direction. So it would have been a building even larger than the current church. I think the dating to the 8th century is primarily based on the architecture of the pier. That's the sort of period, early medieval period, when you get pier rather than current basilicas on Cyprus. And then there's a third building from the Lusignan period, maybe 14th, maybe 15th century, which is a squarish structure there with its apse here. So that's the immediate predecessor of the 16th century structure. Now, what led to the replacement and the reconstruction each time We do not really know whether it was natural disasters, warfare, or something else. As I mentioned earlier, there's no evidence for clear evidence for the cultus and mamas until the Lignon period, which of course raises the question, what were these earlier churches built for? Morphou, as far as we know, was not a particularly important center. Why such a large church, at least the second one on the site, was mamas venerated there already back then? There's no evidence for that, so this remains an open question. For the Lignon period church, there is less uncertainty because we know that by this period, by the 14th, 15th century, Mamas was venerated here at Morphou. There are pilgrim accounts mainly that testify to this. Now, the tomb of the saint is along the north wall here. There we are, in that part of the building, the arcosolium housing an ancient sarcophagus in a very odd, very unusual, very original arrangement. It is half buried. The lid of the sarcophagus, this is an ancient sarcophagus, reused for the relic of St. Mamas. The lid, well, half of the lid is visible inside the church, the other half outside the church. This appears to have been installed there during the construction of the church. I mean, the wall was built, an arch was left underneath to place the sarcophagus, and then the space was filled in to create the arcosolium on the inside. And that's where, again, the photographs by Camille Enlart become crucial in terms of evidence. Now, I should note that this idea of having something significant, whether a tomb or something else, a focus of veneration inside the church and having it advertised on the outside, is something that has been noted elsewhere, and some of my colleagues here have written about this in other monuments, but never in such an overt and unusual way, placing the sarcophagus under the wall. That's what the arcosolium looks like today. This is a drawing by Camille Enlart based on the photograph that he took. He didn't publish the photograph, he published the drawing. So as you see, it hasn't changed that much. And indeed, that was the main interest of Camille Enlart, to examine the sculpture of the arch around the arcosolium, which caught his attention. And here's our first, the previous one, our first Enlart photograph, well, a detail from one of his photographs, showing the north wall from the outside. That's the same thing we see here today. And you can see here on the section of the building, the half-buried sarcophagus, where you have the northern part of the lid visible outside and the other half inside the church. Now, what Enlart shows, well, what his photograph rather shows, is that at that point in the 1890s, there was this structure which no longer exists on the outside, a sort of tabernacle or edicule, which in a way cancels the whole effort of making the sarcophagus visible on the other side, because it is in front of it, although it is still marking the site, and it tells us there is something important there. He does not mention it in the text. In the book, Enlart says absolutely nothing about this structure on the outside. Either he considered it insignificant or not worth talking about, or perhaps like me, he didn't know what to make of it. The dates of it cannot be established unless we discover some other photograph where we can see a bit better what it is, but it's almost certainly not from the time of the construction of the church. It must be later. How much later? I have no idea. Let me see the next slide. Yes, so if you note, this image here is a detail from that photograph top left, right? We are there. So here we can compare the appearance of the building back then and today. And note that we can see a heavy portico extending along the west facade of the church, traces of the same having existed along the north facade. You can see the imprint of the vaults over there. That's not the same portico as the one standing today west, well, enveloping the church from the west and the north. That was a much more recent addition, construction. So the portico that Enlart, the vaulted portico that Enlart photographed, was removed when this one was built in 1907. And the significance of these images is that without them, we would have had no idea. Because today, if you look around the masonry of the church, there's hardly any evidence that there was something there. I mean, the imprint of the vaults that we see there is no longer visible. So it's very useful for that purpose. Another detail, the belfry that Enlart shows there is not the same as this one, which was erected, I think, shortly after the portico. So the significance of this is that it was already up there in 1896 when Enlart visited, and to establish when it was actually added to the church, we have help from something else that Rita uncovered, the drawings of Edmond Dutoit, who was here in Cyprus in 1865. You've got the drawing there by Dutoit of the church from the northwest, taken from the portico opposite, from the monastic buildings. Now, here it doesn't show, we don't see a belfry, we don't see a bell tower. I imagine it's behind this part of the structure in front, but he does mention it in his correspondence. He does talk, Edmond Dutoit, his correspondence does talk about the belfry. So it was already standing in 1865, and we know, of course, that the Ottoman authorities allowed once more the construction of such belfries in the 1850s, so very shortly before the visit of Edmond Dutoit. So we can get an approximate date for that, and it must be among the first erected on Cyprus in that period, following those changes in Ottoman territories. Now, you note that Dutoit also shows the north portico still standing, the one whose imprint we see here. So it was there, demolished between 1865 and Enlart's visit in 1896. And the question here is, when does this water portico date from? What is the relationship to the original structure? Well, it's clearly not from the original phase. I mean, the vaults don't, the imprint of the vaults there suggests that it never bonded, the vaults never bonded with the masonry of the wall, and there are, in any case, the windows of the north aisle there with which the vaulting would have interfered. Underneath, there are the engaged piers supporting the vaults, of which nothing is left today. Their masonry is very similar to that of the church, but again, they do not bond with the masonry of the wall. This may suggest that they were added later, but not too much later after the completion of the church. So maybe still work of the Venetian period, shortly after the completion of the church. And here again, another image by Enlart on the left, showing the west part of the church with the vaulted portico, and you can compare it to today with the light timber-roofed portico that was built in 1907, and all traces of any of that removed, completely invisible today. So again, without this, we would have hardly known that such a vaulted portico existed. It has been completely obliterated. On this side, there were no engaged pilasters. As you see, there are the brackets carrying the ribs and the arches for the vault. Now, a further complication concerning the portico and relating to the images, the photographs by Camille Enlart. The two drawings on the left date from the previous century, from the 18th. Vasily Barsky, who was a monk from Kiev, who traveled extensively in the Balkans, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Holy Land. He spent several years in Cyprus. In fact, he made several trips to Cyprus. He made several drawings of monasteries and buildings. He doesn't show any portico around the church here, but he does say in his account that he didn't draw it very carefully. So perhaps we should assume that something did exist. More intriguing is this drawing from a few years later by Alexander Drummond, who says that there was a mean corridor, as he calls it, in front of the church, so the west facade, but he refused to draw it because it wasn't nice. And yet he does show another structure attached to the north of the church, some sort of annex structure, enclosed structure. So this is not a portico, it's some sort of room attached to where Dutoit shows the northern portico. So what is this? What is the purpose of it? What is it doing there? When does it date from? I don't know. I wonder if initially there was some intention to build something along the north wall of the church, which was subsequently abandoned. I mean, there is evidence of that. Something that was subsequently an idea that was subsequently abandoned and then implemented later on. So perhaps something like this was erected, which was then replaced by the portico. But when exactly all these things happened, I have no idea. And then what would the purpose of that be? A north annex. Imagining that you would go in here and you could see the outer half of the sarcophagus, of the lid at least, of the sarcophagus. Now, this has been linked in scholarship with the possible existence of a Latin chapel. Okay, coming back to the idea of shrines used by both communities on the island, a chapel for the Latin rite, giving access, equal access to the tomb of the saint. Now, I think the evidence here is not that clear. This suggestion in scholarship is primarily based on an erroneous interpretation of a clause in the testament of Denius Leviticus from 1538, where there is something he talks about masses in the church. He doesn't say anything about Latin masses, and the assumption was that he wanted Latin masses as well here. I mean, we can discuss this later on. It's a slightly complicated issue, but I think the Testament at least does not warrant such an interpretation. So we are still in the dark about the function of this northern annex. And I will leave it at that. Now, if you note here in the drawing by Barsky, we can see the enclosure of the monastery, which I think I've got, yes, you can see they're a little bit better here. Now, he shows it, he describes it, he notes in his account, Vasily Barsky, that the monastery looks like a walled city with wide gateways. There is a northern gateway and a western gateway in a very sort of regular layout and quite monumental. And we do have the very useful, extremely useful photograph on top by Camille Enlart, who shows the complex from the same side. And we can see, in a way, he sort of confirms the reliability, to some extent, of Basqui's drawing, we can see the northern part with the gateway still there. This is different, it has been altered, so this gateway was gone by the time of, by the 1890s, replaced by other structures, or perhaps partly pierced by windows, which had added further structures added on top of them. Now, this again, this case of such a monumental, regular enclosure for a monastic compound is quite unique on Cyprus. In most other cases, we have a much more organic layout, and I'll show you a few examples on the next slide. By the way, my assumption is that this dates from the same period as the church, so 16th century. If someone wants to suggest another date, please let me know. I'm basing this on the, again, on the unified conception of this complex and the type of masonry, of course. Now, today, before we talk about today, let me show you a few other monastic enclosures, roughly from the same period. In many cases, they cannot be dated with any precision, but they are either less imposing, of course, in smaller monasteries like Cindy, for example, or sort of less regular, developed over time, as in the case of the Nixos and Neophytos, or Agia Napa, and in other cases, similarly, sort of another Barsky drawing, similarly less regular, let's put it that way. And of course, I should also note that few survive in a decent state nowadays of these things. Now, at St. Mamas, this is still standing, although barely recognizable. This is what we see up there. It has been very much altered, a lot of openings. Now there are offices and shops in there, but the structure is exactly the same. It is recognizable. Of course, all of the west part is now gone. This was also refurbished during the Ottoman period. There is inside the gate, there is an 18th century inscription, but at least we have that to sort of confirm both Enlart and Barsky. This enclosure was partly standing, the western part, of the enclosure was still partly standing in the 20th century. If you look at this photograph from the mid-20th century, it shows the ruins of what must be this part of the enclosure. And of course, Edmond Dutoit made his sketch sitting behind there somewhere under the arcade. So now that is all gone. All the remains were removed in the by the mid-20th century. Now, another element is this staircase, which Enlart, the photograph taken by Enlart also showed, but it's concealed behind there in the old portico, that same staircase, which is no more. This was a staircase leading up to an upper level where there was a gallery added inside the church, presumably in the course of the Ottoman period, so that must be also the date of this staircase, because it blocks the southern doorway there, the one that was subsequently liberated and is visible today. So again, this is something that, we would have known from this photograph, but the older image by Camille Enlart tells us that it was already standing there at the end of the 19th century. And we can see also the access to the staircase in this photograph. There was this sort of wooden gate leading up to the stairs that led to the gallery, to the indoors gallery. So there was a small door open up there. Again, today, note no visible traces of the staircase that stood in front of the south entrance into the south aisle. Again, showing how important this photographic documentation by Enlart is. Now, another, I think that's my last element that I will mention, the roof line. Note that in the photograph by Enlart, the west facade is topped by a horizontal roof line interrupted by this gable representing the vault inside, of course, which is still there today. It is shown horizontal by Baschi, by Drummond, and by everybody else. Now, this was altered again in the early 20th century. I think something like 2 or 3 courses of masonry were removed from the north and south walls. The cornices were placed further down. Of course, the aim was to secure the better evacuation of rainwater from the roof. You might think this is detail, it doesn't change the building that much. The point is that if you imagine this church the way it was at the beginning, when it was completed in the 16th century, without portico, with a flat horizontal roof line, very box-like. It's like a shoebox with the dome, the tall dome on top of it, which is part of its unique architecture. Why does it look like this? Where did the master mason or architect or even the patron, if it was his idea, get this idea from? Again, I do not know. But that's why it's important to establish all these details in order to be able to come to a better assessment of the architecture of the building. So, to conclude, the photographs by Camille Enlart confirm or constitute unique evidence, or only evidence, for several elements, for the changes to the roofline we've just seen that lead to fresh perspectives on the original appearance of the building, the changes to the northern part with that annex and then portico, and then the current, present, standing portico on that side, and then the visibility of the tomb, the sarcophagus on the outside, the belfry issue, the existence of the first belfry that we know mainly from Enlart, the access to the internal gallery from the western part of the building, and the enclosure, the appearance of the original monumental regular enclosure of the complex, mostly destroyed today, and what's left of it much altered, as we've seen. So again, I stress that you might think these are details. It's nothing as significant as the Argacida case or the Bella Pais part that collapsed after Enlart photographed it, or Sensozomenos, which Thomas showed us with the collapsed part of that unfinished church. But every detail here is very helpful to the architectural historian for establishing the original appearance, the architectural references, and what on earth is going on with this unique monument. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we follow with Mrs. Trentin's presentation under the watchful eye of Enlart.
Okay, you're ready. So, I would like to thank first of all Rita for this kind invitation and for giving me the opportunity to see with a new eye something that I met during my study on graffiti and Mason's marks. So Camille Enlart's book, L'Art Gothique, la Renaissance and Ship, continued to be a significant work even after 125 years since its publication. Initially intended... Okay. So initially intended as a historical and archaeological documentation and study of Gothic and Renaissance monument on the island, it has now become a monument in itself. The book is notable not only for the interpretation of the information collected, which was debated and amended over time, but also for the lens used to view the monument. Enlart's approach and understanding of the monument as a diachronic element of the sociocultural landscape of the island, rather than a merely functional structure, was shaped by the consolidation of the concept of cultural heritage and the debate around its preservation during the 19th century. My talk today will briefly illustrate, in the first part, the forging process of Enlart's land by considering the European debate around the historical monuments, their meaning and value, and their restoration preservation process. In the second part, I will present how Enlart's watchful eye, supported by this lens, was able to record and identify previously overlooked aspects that has been neglected until very recent years, and for which his pioneering observation and approach must be acknowledged, specifically for what concerns Mason marks and graffiti. I believe that the best way to start is with Enlart's words. In a short paragraph at the beginning of the foreword, he acknowledged his historian side and apologized to the reader for the historical introduction, always a bit annoying, I guess, so I'm apologizing too, while also explaining why it is necessary for the intent of this work. But beforehand, he inserts a quote by Pierre Messaigne, a normal traveler who during his visit in Cyprus in 1507 observed, my French is terrible, tous ceux du pays et les gentilshommes sont aussi bons français que nous sommes en France. Recording how in Cyprus, still at the beginning of the 16th century, the French legacy was still visible with gentlemen as good as they were in France. So after this quote, Enlart's opened with this paragraph. We'll see them in detail. You can read it while I go on. So the quote that was posed just before this, so the quote from Pierre Messaigne and the fact that he specifically addressed, Enlart specifically addressed the French reader, as you see here, are not by chance, but functional to place this work in line with the author research on the origin, evolution, and diffusion of the medieval Gothic as an autochthonous French style exported, adopted, and adapted in other countries such as Italy and Britain, which Enlart extensively studied. But while in those countries the local tradition embraced and re-elaborated the Gothic, in Cyprus the French Lusitanian introduced it directly from the homeland. At this point, Messaigne's quote seems to create a parallel, at least in Enlart's view, between the Cypriot gentilhomme and the Cypriot Gothic monuments, both aussi bons qu'en France. Enlart so expresses his appreciation for the Cypriot Gothic monument, stating that he was delighted to find in Cyprus the pure Gothic architecture, untouched by the restorers' efforts that changed the character of many medieval buildings in France. And here he refers undoubtedly to the debate around the restoration of historical buildings involving the French school after Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, and the English one with John Ruskin and William Morris, founders of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. Viollet Leduc was the pioneer of the study of French historical monuments and promoter of their restoration. He authored numerous works on the subject, of which the most influential one was the Dictionnaire raisonné de l'architecture française du XIe au VIe siècle, published in 1858. Through different functional categories, religious, military, domestic, public, he analyzed the characteristics of the historic buildings, enriching the description with historical information, structural observation, and plenty of architectural drawings of plans, sections, and details. In his view, archival research, archaeological documentation, and stylistic reconstruction through comparison between buildings are the ways to reconstruct structure in ruins. This process, first realized on paper, soon became a reality, and he was appointed for the restoration of major French monuments such as Notre Dame in Paris, the Castle of Vincennes, and the city of Carcassonne. The Duke was the pioneer of stylistic restoration, which aims to reconstruct the historical monument by bringing it back to its original, real or hypothetical appearance. The Duke's approach was strongly contested by other scholars, such as John Ruskin and William Morris, who saw the stylistic restoration as the destruction of the monument and not its conservation. They supported a very different approach, defined philological restoration. It moves from John Ruskin's view, which considered the monument not only as an architectural, structural, and functional testimony of a specific historical period, but also as an artifact resulting from a specific sociocultural environment and developing over time. The temporal dimension for Ruskin is a constitutive part of the monument that must be documented and kept into consideration during the restoration, or better, in his opinion, the preservation of the monument. A further step within the debate on historical monument was made by Camillo Boito, who in 1883, just a note, Enlart was doing his Italian survey just 6 years after Boito's theories. So Boito defined the monument as a historical document, enhancing the relevance of all phases, from the planning to the material construction, its function and development across time. The monument, recording all this information, becomes in all respects a historical document. And Enlart's words in the forewords reflects this approach. He inserts the historical narration when he says to recall personalities, the principal events, and the most curious details of the history, along with the monument. So he joined together the monument, the physical part, with all the people that created and lived and the events developed there. The monument is seen as part of the history and strongly connected with the people who built it, the work of these men's hands, and people who lived and were part of so many moving episodes. He also highlights this connection and strong mutual relationship between the monument and the local history by saying, it seems to me, so the documentation is talking about his work, it seems to me to be a way of illuminating the significance of the monument and of setting those narratives into their proper context. How to do this? So how to document the monument and the trace history left on it through an archaeological study. And it states it in the beginning. The archaeological approach was certainly the best for documenting and studying the monument's origin, history, and development. A systematic and detailed documentation on the model of the exemplary work of the Duke, enriched with historical information, the history of the building from his planning and construction phase through craftsmanship, recording so also mason marks, and drawing comparison with building in France. But pay attention at the same time to elements that were added at a later stage and are part of the history of the building, such as the state of preservation or different use, like the change of cult from a church to a mosque, or traces the visitor left in the form of graffiti. And to do so, he was using the more up-to-date technology, photography. Photography was officially presented in 1839 and used also by Ruskin in his Venetian survey for the stone in 1849. And it became very popular in the second half of the 19th century for documenting various kinds of surveys. The use of photography made by Enlart needs to be further explored, and I am sure that the acquisition of his photographic archive by the Center of Visual Art and Research will promote this study. For sure, it had a twofold benefit. While offering support to his drawing when not on site, photography also represents a document itself, as we saw just so in the previous presentation. It's able to record the state of preservation and general condition of the monument at that specific moment in time. I've noticed that some of the monuments drawn by Enlart are reconstructed on paper following Leduc's approach, while the picture he took records the actual state, of course, of abandonment and preservation. Two significant examples are the Church of Panagiotis Tassos, and you can see the picture and Enlart's drawing as it published, and in the second case, the Royal Chapel of Pirga. In the Royal Chapel of Pirga, beside the reconstruction of the building in its original form, as it should have been, also with a flag, he inserted a little drawing of the south facade. You see, the south facade in ruin, where the inscription, with description carved on the south door lintel, is visible. This represents, in my opinion, the encounter of the need of identifying and reconstructing the original form of the monument while documenting it as a historical document, so with the sign of time. So when Enlart arrived in Cyprus in March 1896, he carried with him two lenses, that of his camera and his personal one, his point of view, that was shaped by the experiences and debates on historical monuments which occurred mainly between France, England, and Italy. These approaches had now pervaded all of Europe, reaching the Eastern Mediterranean, with Western scholars exploring Cyprus and other destinations such as Syria, Palestine, Greece, and Egypt. Enlart's lens was shaped by Leduc and Ruskin experience, mediated by Boito's holistic approach, able to join what today we would define the tangible and intangible elements of the historical document represented by the monument. Enlart's watchful eye enriched this lens by integrating at least two topics emerging in those years, Mason's mark and graffiti. He understood, even though with some limits due to the state of the art in those fields, the potential and relevance of the new topics. Mason's mark could trace and inform us about the work, and I'm quoting again the opening, the work of these men's hands, he mentioned in the introduction, shedding light into the craftsman and the building process, which became central in the debate following the origins of the art of the craft movement in England. Recording and study this mark correspond to making tangible the invisible work of those masons, emerging beyond Europe, also in secret historical building. On the other hand, by recording graffiti, he was collecting the traces left behind on the monument by the people who lived and were part of so many moving episodes, and I'm quoting him again in the introduction, while at the same time, and again quoting, illuminating the significance of the monument itself. Enlart deserved, of course, recognition for his visionary and innovative approach of considering and recording these elements, firmly believing that they were an essential part of the building's history. Unfortunately, studies on Cyprus mason's mark and graffiti were neglected for many years after him, which further emphasized his comprehensive approach to the monument and the relevance of his contribution. But let's now see in detail how he dealt with mason's mark and graffiti on Cyprus historic buildings. So Mason's mark, the study of Mason's mark started during the 18th century in France, Spain, and Italy with clergymen that began noticing Mason's mark on religious building and became interested in discovering their story and learning more. However, it wasn't until 1835 that the French scholar Prosper Mérimée published the first mention of the presence and functions of Mason's mark. In his work, Notre Voyage dans les Midi de la France, Mérimée recorded the presence of carved letter and related them to the building activities of the Masons. By the second half of the 19th century, the study of Mason's mark had spread throughout France to the Flanders and Northern Europe. Enlart showed to be updated on these studies in the introduction, where he writes, Provence and stone masons made great use throughout the Middle Ages of the carved sign known as Mason's mark. In the Romanesque period, they are usually letters, often in alphabet in old-fashioned style. In the Gothic period, they are generally fancifully designed, geometric or abstract. They can be seen, and then he listed numerous buildings in France and also in Cyprus. It ends with Cyprus. The same marks are seen and you see in which building. Moreover, he adds a note, the number 71, pretty long, with geographical reference for Mason's mark in Europe, from covering the countries from Spain to Germany, highlighting the presence of the same marks in both Cyprus and southern France. During his Cypriot campaign, Enlart documented Mason's mark in 10 sites, while only in one he visited, Mason's mark are present but not mentioned, and it is the case of Ayanapa Monastery. His approach to the mark is in line with the knowledge of that period. While there was a common understanding, I'm sorry, I cannot see that. So while there was a common understanding and attribution of this sign to the masons working on the construction, their functions were not clear yet. As per Enlart's word, marks included, as you can see here, letters often in an old-fashioned style and fanciful design, geometric or abstract, as visible from his drawing. Although his observations were accurate, his interpretation was limited due to the state of the study at that time. In fact, it was only in the mid-20th century that Jean-Louis Van Belle, after conducting extensive research in France and Belgium, both in the field and in archives, was able to classify the various forms and forms of marks and their corresponding function. He divided the marks into identity marks, that are marks that specify the mason's identity for different reasons, such as to mark their ownership, indicate the part of the work effectively done, and consequently the responsibility of the masons in a specific part of the structure, and finally also for publicity reasons. And a second category that are functional marks, which are signs used by the masons in order to help the bricklayer during the construction. These works, these differences in definition works, for instance, in Ayanapa. I hope, you need to use a bit of fantasy because either mason mark or graffiti are not very visible, but I guess you can see them here, maybe not so much here. So in Ayanapa, where identity marks that you see here are placed on the vault of the south gate, so at the entrance, south entrance of the courtyard, publicizing the intervention of specific masons in the work. While in the church entrance, it is possible to notice simpler marks that are functional marks indicating the level of the stones forced to build the vault. The study of mason's mark on the site has begun in recent years as part of the efforts to promote and turn the site into a museum. The initiative is led by Professor Brigitte Schrade at the Free University of Berlin and supported by the Bishopric of Constantine Famagosta and the municipality of Ayia Napa. The identification, documentation, and study of this mark will significantly contribute to understanding their roles and function at the site and offer a valid comparison for the other buildings on the island. It has been observed that mason's marks are frequently found in historical buildings from the Venetian period, especially those from the 16th century. Enlart has already pointed out this fact, suggesting that Venetian reused marked stones. One of the questions that arise is related to the limited use of mason's mark made by Venetian, both in Venice and in the Levant. This aspect has not been fully addressed yet, and it is hoped that further research in this field can shed light on this. To date, the only published collection of Cypriot mason's mark is Enlart's contribution. Despite some initial observation and a new mapping presented at the biannual conference on the Byzantine Society of Cyprus back in 2017, as well as the ongoing documentation of the marks at Ayia Napa Monastery, Enlart's work stands as the most comprehensive record of these marks. Let's now see what he did about graffiti. So Enlart's lens had a second innovative feature, the ability to see and appreciate graffiti as a means of preserving past narratives and events that occurred within the monument's wall. Similar to how mason's marks were treated, Enlart's approach to studying graffiti was elementary, reflecting the initial stage of the research on this topic. The study of historic graffiti in Europe originated with the discovery of the Roman cities of Herculano and Pompeii in the 18th century. Private and public buildings preserved a lively graphic archive scratched and traced onto the wall. The amount and variety of texts and drawings attracted the interest of various scholars who immediately appreciated the value of graffiti as an informal and non-mediated expression able to offer a glimpse into the daily life of the cities. And it is within the study of Pompeian graffiti that the term graffiti appeared for the first time in 1856 by Raffaele Garrucci, who in the second edition of Some Pompeian Graffiti replaced the term inscription gravée au trait with a brand new word graffiti. But while Garrucci was enthusiastic about graffiti and their information potential as a non-mediated source of Roman everyday life, Gustave Flaubert, while traveling in the East in this same period, complained of his contemporaries' graffiti, disfiguring the most famous and important monuments of Egypt. Here in between you can see one of these graffiti traced in the hypostyle room of the Temple of Ramses by the hand of Flaubert's butler, who followed him in his trip to Egypt. Garrucci and Flaubert expressed two antithetical approaches to graffiti. In the first case, graffiti are seen as a precious source, providing original information on the everyday life, writing practices, customs, and habits of ordinary people. The one that we heard are usually represented very small in the corner of building and architecture, that are otherwise not attested by traditional sources. In the second case, after Flaubert, graffiti are seen as the result of a practice, that of commemorating a visit, that is self-referential and celebratory, made by imbecile, as defined by Flaubert, who do not recognize the monument's value and deface it. Nevertheless, this same imbecile mentioned by Flaubert, as it is for his butler, left behind them what today is considered a precious source for recreating the history of Grand Tour in the Middle East and recovering the perception and use of antiquities between the 18th and 19th century. So it's always a matter of lens again and perspective. As we are about to see, Enlart's documentation and narration is in line with this twofold approach towards graffiti. Recognition of their value in the case of historic graffiti, keep in mind that we are talking about the end of the 19th century, while he was not critic but just ignoring coeval graffiti. As it is for Maison's work, Enlart is the first scholar to pay attention to historical graffiti, highlighting their presence and providing context through written sources or by editing textual graffiti and interpreting them. Despite his accuracy, he missed, probably voluntarily, graffiti from some site. Nevertheless, after him we can count very few contributions on graffiti related to specific sites, such as the work of Volanakis and Minardus on Hagia Solomoni, and the paper of Schreiber and Scheibel on the Royal Chapel of Birka. While it was just in the last 2 decades that more extensive research started with the couple of projects, the Karabic project led by Stella Demestica at the Archaeological Research Unit at the University of Cyprus, focused specifically on sheet graffiti, and with other 2 projects, Graphmedia and Digigraph, addressing the historic graffiti heritage of Cyprus, led by me and the Starsiata clubs at the Cyprus Institute. During his documentation campaign, Enlart recorded the presence of graffiti on 5 sites, highlighted with yellow on the map and listed bottom right, while graffiti are also present in other 13 sites he visited, red on the map and listed top left, but with no mention from his side. The first graffiti mentioned are the ones on the main facade of the Selim Mosque, former Santa Sofia Cathedral. After talking about the doorways on the main facade, he adds that on the marble revetment, pilgrims traced drawings and inscriptions, a couple of them ascribable to the 14th century, while the majority to the 15th. To reinforce and maybe legitimate their presence and historical relevance, opening the topic, he quotes a passage from Jacques Lesage, a silk merchant from Douai who visited Cyprus in 1518 on his way to the Holy Land. Lesage mentioned in his account that, and I'm quoting Lesage, many pilgrims have made their marks and put their names on the wall, showing no surprise or condemn towards the action of inscribing the monument. And this was Lesage in 1518. We know, in fact, that graffiti making was a widespread and accepted practice in the past, mostly across the Middle Ages. The study of Detlef Krak is enlightening on this aspect. He investigated the graffiti of Western nobles in the main European shrines between the 14th and 15th century, suggesting that the practice of inscribing names and coat of arms derives from the tradition of hanging flags or wooden insignia outside the places where nobles were hosted to publicize their presence. Graffiti made this practice more durable, since scratched or carved marks would have lasted longer than the banners removed after their departure. We have also a little mystery here concerning Jacques Lesage, and I'm asking also for it and others' help if you have any information about them. So, in Coban's introduction to Lesage account in Excerpta Cypria, Coban's report, his autograph, talking about Lesage, scratched on a wall of the Church of St. Francis in Famagusta, was found in 1901 by Mr. Camille Enlart. So apparently, Lesage too, at a certain point, could not resist and had to scratch his name on the wall, and he chose the church of St. Francis in Famagusta. Unfortunately, we can only trust Cobham. I didn't find any reference in Enlart, so if you come across anything and you want to share, you're welcome, because I'm really curious to see if it was just a chatting between the two, or if something written is left. So we can only trust Cobham, and so far no inscription bearing the name of Lesage has been identified in Famagusta. Nevertheless, it's a likely situation, and it shouldn't surprise us, but it would be nice to have it. A last, most accurate description and study of graffiti is the one concerning the so-called Royal Chapel in Piergam. Here, his attention is captured not only by the architecture and the fresco decoration in a state of ruin, like the entire monument, but above all by graffiti. Names and date of Western visitors, among which two more extensive inscriptions stand out. Thanks to his paleographic skills, Enlart proposed an interpretative reading, specifically of this second inscription, that is influenced by the presence of the term hereticus, that you see underlined here, and by the information collected regarding the building during his fieldwork. He attributes the graffiti, this graffiti specifically, to a Catholic hand, which obviously refers to Orthodox heretics. In support of this thesis, Enlart reports that it is customary among the local Orthodox community to carry out rites against fever linked to the ruins of the ancient chapel. Enlart reports that the devotee rubbed the building with cotton threads, stinodimata, to bring about the end of the epidemic. Enlart's reading and interpretation were corrected and mitigated in tone by Shiver and Schabel in their paper in 2003. Beyond that, the relevant element to underline for the scope of our conference is Enlart's approach. His foresight in including graffiti as a source to recover the past perception and use of the monument, and his attempt to support it, albeit in an approximate way, by collecting contextual information, doing the work that today we will define as cultural anthropology, starting from the religious practices attested in the building at his time, and placing them in relation to material evidence of the past he was finding through graffiti. Despite the limitation imposed by the time, Enlart's approach and the inclusion of graffiti among this element, the element worth to be recorded, was only resumed recently, more than a century later. If Enlart's attentive eye noticed and documented the graffiti in 5 sites with manual copies and trace copy, it is reasonable to ask why he does not mention the graffiti in the other 13 sites he visited, and which still preserve graffiti today. I think, again, the explanation is twofold. In some cases, such as for the Lava Mustafa Pasha Mosque, former church of St. Nicholas in Famagusta, and Gaia Trentin in Paphos, the graffiti were probably not so clearly visible and detectable. The patina still make it difficult to identify the coat of arms and Latin inscription on St. Nicholas facade today. It's not a bad picture, it's really hard to see. While the calcium carbonate, and here we are in Gaia Trentin in Paphos, while the calcium carbonate continuously forming, even after the restoration, continues to limit the visibility and compromise the preservation of graffiti in Gaia Trentin. In other cases, however, the graffiti were certainly clearly visible, as, for example, in San Manuel Morphou, where at the entrance, the main portal, right side, on the left side there's names and dates, while on the right side there's one of the 5 graffiti left by Barsky, the one you saw the drawings before, left also his signature, not actually signature, he left a piece of inscription. dated 1735 and framed by a rich garland. So, despite the description and as we heard the detailed description he doesn't mention, no mention of this graffiti that is still visible today, so for sure it was visible also when enlarged, so the building. Or other examples, at Bella Pais, where the lintel of the main door to the refectory, a room extensively photographed by Enlart, is completely covered with very visible 18th and 19th century pencil inscription, as well as the sarcophagus. Here you can see details of the lintels, as well as the sarcophagus in the cloister. Here, however, the graffiti, due to historical proximity to Enlart's visit, no longer fall into the historical testimony of which Guarducci spoke, but rather into the vandalism denounced by Flaubert. In this case, Enlart's silence is significant. He does not document, but does not condemn, perhaps out of a sort of a scientific respect which, on one hand, pushed him to document the ruins photographically and sometimes even draw them as a witness of the history of the monument, but which still finds it difficult to document a human intervention intended and consciously made by his contemporaries on a monument of undoubted historical value. Despite Enlart's silence, in one case, his photographic documentation is a precious, unaware testimony of the presence of graffiti, which has now been completely lost. This is the case of the medieval chapel of the monastery of Apostolos Andreas. The photo of the interior show the perimeter walls and part of the crossfold were covered with inscription in Greek, most likely from devotees who left their name and prayers inside the shrine. In this way, the faithful fixed their presence in the chapel, ensuring that a part of themselves remained in contact with the sacred, according to the practice of tamata still in force today, which, however, occurs in different ways, leaving personal objects near icons or relics. So, wrapping up this long overview with a few points. Enlarged survey in Cyprus offer a valuable source at least on two levels. The first, for the documentation and description of the Gothic and Renaissance monument of the island, providing a picture of this heritage just before the restoration and modification happened under the British rule, when the government adopted specific policies in line with the rest of Europe concerning the historical built heritage, not always with a positive result. On the other hand, Enlart's lens, despite the limit imposed by the knowledge of his time, represents for sure the first holistic approach to the study of this heritage, paying attention to both the tangible and intangible aspects of the monument. This offered to Cyprus and to the scholars dealing with its history and culture a reference work that is more than the information within it, but it is the mirror of an era and of the man who, as today's conference demonstrates, still has much to tell. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we've come to the last but not least, Mr. Violaris with the presentation, Traditional Professions and Occupations from the Photographic Archive of Camille Enlart. So just a reminder, remarks will be made at the end, or questions, etc. So for these three presentations, we'll take questions at the end.
Καλησπέρα σας. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I would like to warmly thank Dr. Rita Severis for offering me the opportunity to revisit the research field that I have been involved for quite a few years now, namely the traditional professions and occupations of Cyprus. Among the 543 photographs which consist the part of the photographic archive of Camille Enlart, now owned by the Center of Visual Arts and Research, only a small minority, just 25 of them, depict traditional professions or occupations. 15 of those were taken by Enlart and 7 by Theodore Mavrocordato, commander of the police in Limassol and Paphos at that time. The remaining 3 photographs are not signed, but according to Rita, they can be attributed to Enlart. It is well known that during his missions in Cyprus in 1896 and 1911, he was helped and accompanied in his journeys through the island by various governmental officials who also supplied him with photographs. The total number of the latter is 45, 24 of which were actually taken by the aforementioned Theodore Mavrocordato. One might think that 25 photographs are not so much, and the truth is that the subjects represented have been dealt with even earlier by other photographers of the early colonial period. However, it is needless to say how precious they are when we consider the social and economic situation of the late 19th to early 20th century Cyprus. If nothing else, they are rare testimonies of an archaic world that vanished in front of our very eyes, as Fernand Baudel has rightly pointed out about 40 years ago. Camille Enlart used photography complementary to other means like architectural drawing and verbal descriptions in his effort to record accurately the Gothic architectural heritage of Cyprus, following the scientific practices of his time. He belongs to the people who understood early the benefits of photography, but apart from the static views of archaeological sites and ancient monuments, he also illustrates more lively and narrative scenes. These are the photographs I will be talking about in a minute. They capture scenes of everyday life, both in the lively city markets and the countryside. I will attempt to make some ethnographic and other comments and observations on these images, both by extracting information and using them as a starting point to build on. The agora or market or bazaar, the animal fair, the khan, the coffee shop, the wandering seller of bread, the sellers of thyme, various images of threshing are some of the subjects captured by Camille Enlart. As stated earlier, he was not the first one. Before him, Luigi Balman di Cesnola, which we see here, John P. Foscolo, Max Onefars Richter, and to a lesser extent, John Thompson, photographed similar scenes. Luigi Balman di Cesnola was the first one who photographed portraits, especially the workers of his excavations, and it is inevitable not to notice the sharpness in which he observed the Cypriot peasants. Needless to say that today, ethnography and photography are considered as complementary tools. Enlart lived at a time when both photography and ethnography were still at an early stage. These images become valuable illustrative supports and a way of detailing ethnographic observation. They are a kind of a visual field book and a magnifying glass of the past. At the same time, they preserve memory, so they enable us to initiate a dialogue with the past, and after all, they are very useful for scientific analysis. Enlart was neither a photographer, neither an ethnographer, nor a professional photographer. He was, however, an archaeologist and an art historian, so his photographs incorporate both the anthropological approach as well as the photographer's gaze, and this is somehow reflected in the captions of the photographs written by Enlart himself on the reverse of the strong paper where the photographs were mounted. The regime change in 1878 from Turkish to British was probably the most important event in the modern history of Cyprus, with political, social, economic, and cultural impacts. These photographs are therefore a valuable historical record of the island, its people, and the socio-economic conditions of the time, a time of transition. Cyprus's ancient monuments and antiquities did not attract the interest of the great museums of the Western world before the beginning of the 19th century. During the second half of the same century, this interest was transformed into an intense competition. This was not irrelevant to the change in the geopolitical orientations of the European powers in the Eastern Mediterranean and, of course, Cyprus. It is not surprising that during the same period, a great abundance of travelers' accounts, scientific books, and articles on every aspect of the island were written by Westerners. This phenomenon was justly characterized as a new Frankish invasion in Cyprus, specifically an academic one, due to the fact that the European powers realized that the declining Ottoman Empire would not be able to hold Cyprus for long. They initiated a succession race between them. So the eyewitnesses' accounts and the scientific studies were aiming at setting up the necessary theoretical background. I believe that Camille Enlart's remarkable work on Cyprus can also be seen under this lens. The fact that he visited Cyprus under the auspices of the Ministère de l'Instruction Publique et des Beaux-Arts in order to record monuments which mainly associate Cyprus to France speaks by itself. It must be noted, however, that it's especially to the French that we owe the first photograph of Cyprus during the second half of the 19th century. It's not this one. Why traditional occupations and professions? This particular field of research provides us with important insights into the organization of traditional or ancient societies, which enable us to better understand them. In order to reconstruct the social and intellectual development of a society, its cultural identity and physiognomy, we must explore the economic and technical infrastructure which supported the letters, the arts, and the institutions. When we refer to traditional societies, we must not forget that they were ultimately agricultural, and the economy was mainly based on the primary and secondary sector of production. The big urban centers organized the economic and commercial activities. Most of the craftsmen were based there, and it was in the cities that most of the processing of raw materials into final products used to take place, as well as the exchange and circulation of various products. The cities were the epicenter of economic life, even for the peasants. On the other hand, they depended on the support of the countryside, both for the supply of agricultural and animal products and raw materials, as well as for their circulation. Religious fairs played a vital role in economic and professional life, and the same applies to permanent or weekly markets, including animal markets, which we will see in a while. A fair was primarily a religious celebration, but at the same time an important commercial and social event during which people from various places came together, trade their products, make various kinds of agreements, set up marriages, etc. Now I think it's about time to start looking at the photos themselves. I will start with two photos taken by Camille Enlart of the Gynekopazar, the women's market, which used to take place every Friday, a custom from the period of Turkocratia, in order to give the chance to the Muslims to attend. At the time of Enlart and until 1922, it used to take place at the north end of Makridromos, later named Lydras Street, at the point where it meets with Elmou Street. As implied by its name, the women of Nicosia, the suburbs and surrounding villages traded their products there, which mainly consisted of hand-woven textiles, clothing, and so on. It is mentioned by travelers that it was the least noisy bazaar of Nicosia, and that the Greek women were master rhetors in their attempt to sell their products. Another traveler mentions that at the Ginekobazaron, one has a chance to see the most beautiful Turkish women who accidentally, according to him, showed their face under the veil. In any case, there we see another contemporary shot of the Ginekobazaron, almost a bird's eye view, I would say, by John P. Foskolo. The difference here is that despite the fact that that from Foskolo's photograph we get a better view of the setting, Enlart's photographs are views from the level of the street, and thus they enable us to mingle with the crowd, live for a moment the lively and colorful Ginekobazaron, and to almost encounter the people selling their products or walking around in this area of Makridromos. Now let us move to another most picturesque and lively photograph of Theodore Mavrocordato this time, taken somewhere at the bazaar of Nicosia, in a narrow and crowded street which seems to be shaded by the kind of sheds or tents called turades, used extensively in the East to protect people from the sun and rain. We see in the middle of the foreground a wandering seller of bread. The wandering sellers in the cities would arrive at a specific time and place, often wearing a specific outfit. By wearing a kind of uniform, each profession was associated with a specific figure, so everybody could recognize them. The first wandering seller to go out on the street was usually the seller of salep. Then others followed, like the seller of bread, the milkman, and so on. But let us look at some details of this photograph. On his right shoulder, he carries over 20 loaves of bread. And notice in the background there is someone who carries 3 or 4 loaves who has just bought them. All piled up on a pinakoti or vuposanido, where they used to put the dough to rise and take the shape of the bread. They were usually made by people of the Troodos Mountains, especially the village of Moutoulas, which was famous for its scaffes, the wooden basins used for kneading. In these pictures, we see that the vuposanida were also used for carrying the baked bread. Notice the cushion on the man's right shoulder, where the vuposanidon rests, in order to allow him to carry the load around without hurting his shoulder. We can even observe the way he fastens the cushion with a piece of rope around his back and under his right armpit. What can be said about the black seller of bread? From ancient Cyprus, we only have indirect evidence of blacks based on art representations on objects which were imported to Cyprus. According to the late Vassos Karagiorgis, who wrote a small monograph entitled Blacks in Ancient Cypriot Art, contacts with Africa during antiquity seem to have been mostly indirect through Egypt. The earliest representation of a black in Cyprus comes from an Egyptian faience bead of the Middle Bronze Age found in a tomb at Lapithos. The Egyptians used Nubians as servants and mercenaries. During the classical period, the Greeks and Cypriots became even more familiar with the Ethiopians and other Africans as a result of their contacts with the Persians, who employed blacks as mercenaries. There are numerous representations of Ethiopian soldiers on antique vases, a couple of which were found in Cyprus, in Salamis and Mario, if I remember correctly. Greek myths and literature give a prominent place to Ethiopians, and their frequent representation of 5th and 4th century art is noticeable. Under the Ptolemies, in the next period, Cyprus became familiar with an art which was often inspired by blacks. The interest of artists of the Hellenistic world in realistic portraiture was often expressed in portraits of black men, women, and boys. The Romans, as a result of their activities in Africa, became very familiar with the Africans, as it is illustrated in their art and literature. Blacks must have been widespread in various regions of the Roman Empire as slaves or mercenaries. During the medieval period, the presence of Muslim and black slaves is attested in the sources. Of course, the case of the slaves is complex, and in Cyprus they are mentioned both as domestic and rural servants. These slaves were soon assimilated with the native Greek population, both culturally and socially. Their tender age must have contributed to their assimilation. Consequently, there exist several examples of Muslim slaves with Greek names, but the blacks in Cyprus during the medieval period do not seem to have been that many. Their number increased after the Turkish occupation of Cyprus, and especially during the 17th century, because of the increase in slave trade and also because of the habit to assign the cultivation of the large areas of land owned by the FTAF mainly to African slaves. Towards the end of the 19th century, their presence on the island became noticeable, as we judged from various travelers' accounts. It is not surprising that most of them became Muslims, following the religion of their masters, who were mainly rich Muslims, in other words, belonging to the dominant class. The presence of blacks was also quite noticeable in Turkish Cypriot and mixed communities of the island up until 1974, both due to their color, of course, and the names given to them with the prefix Kara in Turkish, for example, Kara Ali or Kara Suleiman, and Mavros in Greek, for example, Mavrosmanos or Iosifis or Mavros. Mavrocordado's photograph reminded me of this watercolor of Edmond Dudois, dated on 1962 or 1865, depicting a black wandering seller of grapes. And here is another later photograph of a wandering seller of koulouria or sesame bread. I think you can spot many similarities between both the two photographs in the watercolor. Now, from the Bazaar of Nicosia, we move through another photo of Mavrocordato, according to Allah's inscription, to the Bazaar of Famagusta. Here we clearly see the turades I was talking about earlier, which in Nicosia was forbidden by law in 1930 under the mayoralty of Themistocles Dersis. Their use, apart from providing shade, was for the shopkeepers to hand their merchandise. And to the left, I think we cannot even distinguish from here, some ludzas, I think, here, and here some sujukus hanging from the turales, here and here. And of course, the baskets, everybody can recognize those. To the right of the street, we can see the famous potatoes of the Kokinohoria area and two scales to weigh them. At the time when this photo was taken, the shops and workshops of Famagusta were located around the church of Agios Nikolaos, and the locals called this area the market or the bazaar, as the inscription of the photograph confirms. The people of Larnaca, up until around 1930, were referring to Famagusta as the city with two lanes, Vio Lures, as it only had two main streets parallel to each other. On one of these dirt roads, most of the shops, workshops, and the hands were located, and it surely is the road we see here. I believe that it cannot be anything else than the later named Ermou Street, the famous commercial road of Famagusta, which we see here in another photograph taken in 1925, of course not by Enlart. It is obvious that during the 3 decades that separate these two photos, things did not change much. However, through photos of successive periods, we can observe the development of the center of the commercial life of the city and probably some changes in society also. Moving on to the medieval city of Famagusta, we have 2 photos attributed to Enlart, which represent a couple of drumbarides, in other words, sellers of thyme. They could possibly be a husband and wife driving 4 donkeys heavily loaded with branches of thyme. On one of the 2 photos, which we see here, one of the 2 photos, which we see here, is taken just in front of the facade of the Venetian palace or Palazzo del Provveditore. The thyme, or thrumbin, or Thymus capitalus, apart from its pharmaceutical and aromatic qualities, was used as a fuel for firing domestic kilns for baking bread. Other bushes were also used, like the spatch, or mazin, or Sarcopoterium spinosum. The harvesting and circulation of these bushes was done by the Drumbarians, who supplied households as well as shepherds to make the halloumi, bakers, makers of the traditional brooms, the sarkes, and others. The most useful parts for firing are the roots, so they used pickaxes to uproot the bushes. Very often, the children of the family were involved in the whole process. Around every town or village, ανοίξε μου ένα παράθυρο και βλέπω τι. Around every town or village, there were areas where these bushes thrived, sometimes called drumberi or mazera. For the city of Nicosia, for example, they used to harvest them from the area of Panagiotissa, as its name implies, while for Famagusta, it was the men and women of Paralimni who supplied the city with these useful and essential bushes, which abound around the area of their village. They used to go around the streets of the city, hawking their merchandise, and usually sell the whole load, called gomarin, to one buyer. From the above-mentioned information, it can be then argued that the couple of drumbarians in these pictures come from Paralimni. This is confirmed by the way the woman wears her apron, which allows her long pants to be seen on the side. And this was considered to be shocking at the early 20th century, so the municipality forbade them to enter the city like this. And they had to wear a kind of apron around them. So they would wear this as they were entering the city and take it off when they are leaving. Moving outside the walls of Famagusta, no, we are not moving outside the walls. So we moved outside the walls of Famagusta, and from there we have 3 photographs taken by Camille Enlart. 2 of them bear the inscription La Foire ou Panegyrie de Saint-Barnabé à Famagusta, and the third one simply La Foire de Saint-Barnabé. We know that apart from the Pentecost Monday or Peraklismos, fair, 3 big fairs took place at Famagusta, including that of St. Barnabas. And it took place at the city, not at the monastery. Many vendors from Nicosia, Larnaca, and other cities and villages attended this fair, and a big part of them was the buying and selling of animals, as these photos confirm. We distinguish lots of donkeys, camels, mules, and oxen at least. If our impression is right, it seems that this specific fair used to take place at the area outside the land gate of Famagusta to the northwest, between the Martinengo bastion and the gate, closer to the latter. In these two photos at the background, we see the land gate building before the removal of this later addition, which stands higher than the rest of the building. It is mentioned that in older times, meaning until the first years of the 20th century, the big fairs of Famagusta used to take place in this area, where the governmental offices were later built. In this map, published by Bever, the area shown in the photographs is roughly where the north direction arrow is. And I would like to thank very much Dr. Tassos Papacostas for his valuable help in identifying the spot where these photographs were taken. I think it was expanding a bit on the matter of animal fairs and markets, which of course took place in open areas away from the food markets. The whole process of buying and selling animals was regulated by a specialized and highly respected person called jambazis, for the Turkish word jambaz, who acted as a middleman. Now, the next 3 photos I will be showing are not from Camille Enlart. They were taken in the 30s in Famagusta by Andreas Sotiriou. The Jambasides of Messauria were famous all around the island. They had information on who wanted to sell or buy animals and were able to recognize the advantages and disadvantages of each animal. During the big fairs, many people brought their animals for sale, and small groups of interested people gathered here and there. All the discussions, bargains, and agreements were regulated by the Jambazis, who was always well dressed and stood out of the crowd. As the process went on, he would do his best to come to a deal, and this was usually the outcome. The Jambazis would take commission both from the buyer and the seller, and apart from that, the seller had to pay for the feast, the kupeteki, which always took place after the transaction at a nearby coffee shop or taverna. And in this photograph, taken during the 30s, taken by Andreas Sotiriou at the fair of Palm Sand in Famagusta, we have the chance to take a closer look at the people, and the person in the middle with the stick is a Jambazis. The fact remains that this photo proves that the traditional way of life went on also during the 30s and even later. It was only after the Second World War when things started changing fast, and soon we lost our connections to our past. The next 2 photos from Enlart's collection can be used as a springboard to talk a little about the matter of children working as helpers of craftsmen, the so-called churakia or mistarki. One of the photos depicts a barber and the other one a blacksmith, both with their young helpers. The first is without provenance, while the second one, the blacksmith, is from Nicosia. Just a few words about the barber first, if I may. During the period of Turkish occupation, the barbers were usually Greeks, and in the busy bazaars of cities like Nicosia, one could locate them through the white cloth they used to suspend from a long wooden pole installed outside their shops. In the countryside, the barbers did not usually have a permanent place of work, but they used to go around the villages of their area to serve their clients. Apart from haircuts and trimming mustaches and beards, the traditional barbers offered other services like bloodletting with leeches, as well as extraction of bad teeth by pulling them out with pincers. Ouch. In the past, children were engaged in all aspects of domestic economy and all stages of the production process, even exposed to the most unhealthy conditions of the mines. The prevailing economic and social status of Cyprus during the late 19th and early 20th century meant that a lot of children would have to be sent to a craftsman to work many times away from their families and without being paid, just to learn the job. They often stayed with their boss and were also engaged in the housework. These children were usually mistreated and got beaten up on a daily basis. Antoniou and Spirou took a lot of interviews of people who experienced this kind of situations during their tender age. One of them said, "We learned the job with the blood of our souls." The same applied to children from poor families who were given to big landowners in order to work in the fields. And I think that the look and the expression of both children in these photos says everything. Now, moving on to an important agricultural activity this time, namely threshing, it should be noted that there are 5 relevant photographs by Camille Enlart showing that for some reason threshing attracted his attention. During the period of Turkish occupation, Cyprus exported a portion of its main agricultural products, including wheat and barley. Up until the 1950s, the traditional pre-industrial methods of threshing survived on the island. The threshing floor was considered to be almost sacred, and the oxen were the most important assets of the domestic economy, vital for the surviving of the family. They were used both for plowing and threshing, as well as a means of transportation for pulling the cart. Due to the importance of the oxen, the Cypriots respected them and they would never eat beef or drink cow's milk. When the British took over the administration of the island, the demand for beef and bovine milk increased and things gradually changed. The pottery of Famagusta did not escape Camille Enlart's attention. It is represented by at least one photograph where we see a cart loaded with the famous pottery of Famagusta. The pottery workshops were family business which passed on from one generation to the other, as other arts, of course. They supplied the whole of the island, as the white clay of Famagusta was most suitable, especially for pots used for carrying, storing, and serving water. In recent times, they were located to the north periphery of the city. Now, in this photograph, if we draw our attention away from the central subject, the cart with the pots, we can observe something a bit different. Here, on this building to the left, there is a lamp attached high up on the wall. These lamps were used for street lighting, for the street lighting of Famagusta, and they were made by local craftsmen. They remained in use up until 1924, when they were replaced by electric poles with cables. And this photo, a later photo, again taken in the 30s from a fair in Famagusta, where we can see that the local pottery industry was still thriving, of course. So in closing, it may be needless to say that today we have realized that Camille Enlart, apart from a devoted scholar, a talented draftsman and topographer, he was also an excellent photographer. If one examines closely his photographs, it becomes obvious that apart from the monuments and the movable objects, They also capture the psychology and the psyche of the people of Cyprus. They therefore become a dynamic visual support to the written sources and the oral testimonies, but at the same time, they incorporate his own generous and affectionate nature. And finally, I would like to wish every success to the Center of Visual Arts and Research, hoping that it will keep on finding new archival material on our small but so rich in history and culture island. Thank you very much for your attention.
Do we have any questions for the last three presentations? Yes.
It's not a question, but I want to add something. If we go back to the one of the slides, bread salad.
Which one?
Bread salad. Yes. This guy here is selling sherbet. He's selling it on a kind of lemonade. He carries the glasses.
What is he? Please repeat.
Sherbet.
Something sweet. Sherbet. Yes.
Sherbet salad.
Okay.
This is the part which he carries on his shoulder.
I didn't notice that. Okay.
Yes. And this is the ornament.
For the glasses.
Yes. What this is, as you can see, the bell.
Of course.
Some, according to the type of glasses, tin or I don't know. Also, some of them have their jackets with very much ornaments.
These are best sellers.
Yes, giving a noise, ding, 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 like that. So things on that. If you give me a mail, I can send you not from Cyprus, from Turkey.
Oh yes, I think I have also from.
I remember up to around just before 60s, they used to walk around the streets and they were selling it.
In Cyprus.
Yeah, in Cyprus, one of them was my neighbor.
Okay, thank you very much. I didn't notice it. Sorry, thanks.
And we had another question from.
Yes. For Professor Papacostas, concerning the addition of the North Wall of the Church of Mars, possibly one should consider that that's got something to do with the surrounding stoa. In other words, there's a continuous portico on the inside and a black face on the outside, without much, yes, windows. So what is that stoa for? Is it for visitors to stay?
I mean, on the north and west side of the church.
Yes, going around the courtyard.
Yeah. Or around the courtyard.
Yes.
So, the furniture. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I just wondered, could it be something to do with that? Such as it might be residence of a warden, somebody who's in charge of those guests staying.
Well, yeah, well, there were last communities or residents there, so they must have had their cells in the corner. Everyone can hear me. So there must have been a last community residents in one spot, one wing, possibly. And then the pilgrims who came from far away would need accommodation, because they did stay there. I mean, there is early evidence of that since maybe even in the late 16th century, pilgrims arriving and noting that there's a hospital, there is accommodation for visitors to the mass. So, and I imagine it would have been very similar in other monasteries, or like Pico and other places, which have such portico structures around or near the church. Yeah.
Connected with the north
not annex to the
Annex,
church.
that's what annex. So from what I understood, you don't have evidence, or it's questionable if it was born that part with the building or added later.
Yes. Well, first of all,
In the microphone, please.
so the question is what's happening with the North Annex at St. Mamas and when it was erected and whether it's contemporaneous with the rest of the church. Contemporaneous, probably not. It doesn't appear to have been built at the same time. What there is evidence for is that there was the intention to have something there because there is a door at the end of the northern wall where the belfry, above which the belfry stands, which is a door leading from inside the northern part of the bima towards the other side, which is now the outside. But that looks like a door leading, I mean, the way the frame of the door is built seems to be leading into a room, not to the outside. I mean, it's sort of external side, inside the church. It's the other way around, the way it is built. And it seems to be from the original phase, which suggests that something was intended on the other side. But then you have the windows, which suggests you cannot have had something with the windows opening in an internal enclosed space.
I don't remember the levels between the.
Well, unless it's very low, yes. And the one that Drummond shows is low. I don't know if it's low enough to avoid the windows above.
I was just wondering, studying mathematics. It's a different case, but we know that people usually mostly not wear only they wear leggings, but they wear home. So I was thinking that even the fact that the sarcophagus is half in and half out, I mean, maybe people were sleeping there.
Incubation next to the relic. Yeah.
And because talking, we did a couple of visits in London space and also talked with local communities. And until before COVID, the night before the visit, the same people were taking the mattress and sleep in the mattress.
Yeah, and
So
also maybe in the so-called Latin chapel. Yeah, that's a very good suggestion. Thank you. Worth considering and comparing. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, thank you.
And it seems the founders was also thinking about, let's say, targeting the pilgrims there.
Yeah. Yeah, very good idea. Thank you. Yes. Thanks.
Tassos, I would like to say that on the roof there is a parapet in St. Mamas. Maybe that parapet was made at the end of the 19th or 20th century.
Which side?
It's a sciteo.
Yeah.
We have the same characteristic in the church in Famagusta in Parosha.
Yeah.
So I know that because he this monument, he got up to the roof and he rearranged it as a comparative material to St. Nicholas of Famagusta. So this maybe answers the difference between the photograph of Camille Enlart to the
Well, on the eastern side, so where the apse is left and right, which I didn't show a photograph of, it is preserved, the original horizontal part. And then when it comes to north and south, it has been lowered, and then to the west, it has been, a sort of gable has been created. So I don't know if you mean that part, that's a bit higher. Indeed, it looks like a parapet.
Yeah, maybe it's only on the two sides, north and south. But I didn't saw it, but I know that it's a parapet.
Yes, I think that emerged when the roof was repaired in the maybe 50s or 60s, or the ceiling was taken out to make it lighter and to, again, deal with the evacuation of water. And a lot of filling was removed from the top of the vaults, which must have stood between the outer part of the vault and the walls, whether north or south. So maybe it's Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, well, Kyrios, the gentleman.
About the island and the stores to the north and the west, do you consider that those two are constructed in the same period?
Well, they look very similar, even though one has the H piers, the other has brackets for the bolts. They look similar. I mean, of course, for the north, we only have the boudoir drawing. For the west, we have our last photograph, which shows it still standing before, whereas in the north, it was removed by his time. So we cannot be certain that they look exactly the same, i.e., same period.
The glass drawing, the glass drawing, they seem to be similar.
Yeah, it looks very similar. Yeah.
Excellent, this is a sketch. Maybe we should not rely absolutely on that. My eye, the north store, it should be taller than the west.
You mean the height reached by the walls?
Yeah, see the trends with the wall and the height of the and also the it seems that the north one have ribs on the drawing board. Due to the existence of the spring.
Yeah, possibly.
So
Yeah.
maybe we have two different phases.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a good observation.
And again, if we compare the Western one with a couple of other churches which are dated to the 19th century or second half of the 19th century with great similarities. Then we may go to the 19th century for the Western part, and probably an earlier one for the
Okay, so you would suggest the vault at Western Portugal, 19th century, before Dutoit, so maybe first half of the century, and the northern part earlier.
The last drawing is 19th century.
1865, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so the original North one should be from different. Let's say it's understanding in because
Okay. It is, yeah. Okay, maybe, I mean, considering what these photographs reveal, so many things that we wouldn't have known without them, we may discover someone else's drawings from the 18th century which show something even different, and then have.
and of course in this case very vast not to see that as
Yeah, but it's not, I mean, he doesn't show it, and that's it. It doesn't mean that it didn't exist. Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you.
The lady, yes.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting presentation. I'm interested on Zenio because he was he was the kind of founder, right, of this church. And from hearing and listening to his vision where he wanted to be buried, you're not sure whether he was an Orthodox or of the Latin way, because he said, if I die, because here buried in a Latin church, if I die in Morphou, bury me in an Orthodox church. And this was common from the 15th century with Papacostas, for example, who said, when I die, well, he was converted to the Latin rite, but in his will he wanted to be buried in an Orthodox. Anyway, what was he? Was he a Greek Orthodox or was he converted to the Latin rite? Because I suppose he was a noble by the traditions. He was.
I don't know what he considered himself when he talks about his mansion in Nicosia and masses being taking place in the chapel of the mansion, which stood near the Paphos gate. He makes provision for both Latin and Greek masses, and he says, depending on whatever my descendants want, whoever is there, whoever the lady of the house is, if she wants a Greek mass, there will be money for that. If she wants a Latin mass, there will be money for that. So I don't think they thought about this in such a binary sort of opposition that you must be either one or the other. They were very much in between. I mean, in his family there's an Orthodox bishop of Famagusta, a Greek bishop rather, of Famagusta, And they are members of the Latin clergy as well. So, yeah, similar.
It's a very interesting characteristic of the Cyprus society in the 15th and 16th century.
Yeah.
This kind of integration.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't have this conflict that so. But I suppose that was not in the whole of the society. Maybe in society. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, among the elites. Yeah. Could I ask a question, maybe for Yiannis or whoever else might know this, comparing those sort of history of architecture photographs that Enlart took or got hold of? Do we know of what he did elsewhere, like his travels in Italy and other places? Was he equally interested in daily life? Has anyone seen anything? Because I haven't looked for this. So, did he photograph Italian farmers? And
I have no idea.
yeah.
I'll say very good.
Okay, thank you.
Sounds really good.
The lady with the
I had a glimpse of Morphou when I was before teenagehood, around 10. I'm sorry, as I said earlier. So I had a glimpse with all the orange clothes and everything, and I was trying to imagine what Morphou would look when the church was built. And, how dense the population was. And obviously they couldn't cultivate olive trees.
Yeah, well, there is a slight difficulty there in the Venetian documents, which list taxpayers and incomes from villages. Morphou appears with a tiny number of people, which is very odd. So either there's a mistake, because in other accounts, historical accounts, it is mentioned among the largest villages on Cyprus. But when you look at the census data, it's a very small number of people. So there's something odd going on there, which I don't know how to explain. But I would trust at least in terms of numbers of people living there and agriculture and all that, it must have been quite extensive. I mean, there was sugarcane plantations in the area, in the wider area, so presumably that was the main crops until later on oranges and citrus were introduced much later. So that's the impression I get.
Tassos, regarding your question, I don't think that Enlart photographed elsewhere rural lives or the people.
Okay.
At least when I visited the house and visited his study, etc., and talked with his grandson, Cyprus was unique for him.
Okay. Which is nice to know.
He stayed much longer.
Okay. So.
And coming back as well.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
These are history from February to May. The second one, we know.
The other ones were shorter, I think. Could I ask Gaia a question about how did he select which graffiti to record and which not to, and also Mason Mount, because there are Mason Mounts at St. Mamas as well. He doesn't do anything with them.
So, for sure, one, as I said, he privileged what for him was historic graffiti. So for sure, what he could define as medieval. Gothic inscriptions, Latin characters, Modovan for sure. So everything that he could say safely is from that period. I'm wondering something else I haven't mentioned. There's also, let's say, in Bellatar, the entrance to the church. The picture also of the church. There's one column, and also in the entrance there's graffiti. On the column there's Gothic inscription, coat of arms, and signs that are typically Western.
So I'm wondering maybe they were not visible because today it's like there's layers of paint that fell out. So I think it's a combination. So sometimes visibility, sometimes volatile. There's a picture of the big hole, not directly
The dormitory.
dormitory. And there, for example, there's a big carved inscription on the Capitol.
Yeah.
That one is in this picture, everything is covered by vegetation.
True. Yeah.
So I think it's a mixture about between the two, but for sure he selects and will record something 18th, 19th century. So it makes sense.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a question. I don't know who can answer this, but in terms of his travels, we're looking at the monuments that he took. But in practical terms, he was carrying what kind of camera, how many photos was he able to take in a day of a monument? You know, this might impact on how he was photographing these monuments and what he could record. So he was specifically choosing things that were visible or invisible or whatever. So in terms of practicality, do we have any record? Do we have any notes or anything like that? Like what kind of camera was he? Was he using
because I don't know anything about cameras.
No, but I mean, are they lantern slides? Are they glass plate negatives?
There were some lantern slides.
Okay.
I know that there is a collection of lantern slides. But these ones were printed.
Were printed, but what were they printed from? Were they glass plate negatives? Was he, if he was carrying a big, heavy camera around,
I simply it was glass plates, wasn't it? It was glass plates, wasn't it? To some extent.
A collection of glass plates.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is why a lot of them got damaged or destroyed.
Which is also begs the question that, you know, taking photos of people means they have to be absolutely still for the exposure. Whereas the buildings are easier to take photos of because there's nothing, nothing to move. So I think that maybe we've got the practical thing of late 19th century. Because there are other travellers around at this point, not in Cyprus, just in Cyprus, but in the Middle East, in Greece, that are heaving around big bits of equipment to take photos.
He was taking pictures of someone.
He was taking.
He would have had help.
He was taking. Can I say something? He just borrowed shoes from. He asked his friends to send him a few that was missing, specifically what he was after, because he wanted to complete a book, his text.
So we've got a comment here about photography.
Yes, during those years, cameras were mostly made by wooden.
No,
they used to use glass negatives.
Yes, I know. That's what I'm saying.
The dry plate was introduced in the 1880s, and also just after they introduced the gelatin material. Then I think they are using glass negatives.
That's what I'm pointing out. Is that he's only taking so many photos of the monument because he only has so many glass plates. These are heavy things to carry around.
He took masses of photographs of friends of his. Masses.
He was staying in Nicosia, whereas if when he's going out to Morphou and out to the countryside to take photos, he would be able to carry as many without having a break or damage.
I was asking to his statement. You quoted a name during your presentation that his name is supposedly on the walls of Franciscan monastery. Can you repeat it, please?
Lesage.
Okay.
Can I ask you something? The graffiti is supposed to be basket graffiti on the column of St. Mamas. Have you been and checked the date?
The date?
The date?
All the five graffiti are 1735.
But
Did I say something different?
No, it's excellent. In fact, did you actually see it?
Yeah.
Because I think it's 57, and there is a belief. Now, this is just some scholars believe that this is not a real Basti, it's a pseudo-Basti, like we have pseudo-Gothic. And it was, in fact, made by Rupert Canis. Because the date doesn't match.
But
I think.
we have another Basti in Italo Panayotis.
We have five.
Yes, there are a lot of Basques. So it's just because. No, he did it.
If you compare it between
Basque, he did it. But this one is supposed to be a copy.
I actually had a doubt about the most sure one, that is the one Yiannis Violaris Christagis. It's the only one with the date, meaning also the date and the month.
And I come from here. Yes.
Yeah, always. But not even in his diary we have the date with date and month. So that one and the maybe one day try to go back and see when it started. It's 4 weeks because we don't know.
1726, 1755 was the last.
Yeah, but we don't know the date exactly because they always use the feast, religious feast after the first Sunday after. I try to count them. Anyway, I had doubts on that one, and I thought with the Noctas because that one, Yiannis Violaris Davis is so well done that I was really impressed. Yeah, impressed. I think the best one is the one. The frame is better, but the writing.
Sorry. Can I ask one question to Tassos and one question to you? Well, Tassos, can we say that the architect or the builders of Agios Mamas and St. Neophytos, Agios Neophytos, is the same? Was the same team or the same architect?
I cannot, but maybe someone else can. I mean, the Catholicon of the English of the Paphos is similar in terms of the architectural type. The details are very different. I mean, the capitals, again, the roof line, all sorts of other differences, but they are both, they are really, if not brothers, sisters, they are cousins. So very closely related. The English Catholicon is probably 2 decades earlier, if my dating of it is correct. So St. Mamas is later. Is it the same workshop, traveling around Cyprus, doing things, but since there is nothing else so closely linked, I really don't know. I cannot tell.
Can I ask, you show us the Star of David, the graffiti with the Star of David. Star of David was used by Ottomans since 1948. Is this medieval graffiti or an Ottoman?
It's not only there are buildings in all museum knows the Star of David. They are dating much earlier than now.
But they stopped in 1948 when the state of Israel. And it was stopped in 1948. But we have it in previous Ottoman buildings. We have this graffiti.
Yeah, I think we have some of these in which is not very frequent, but it seems to be one of something linked with the protection of funds, but not linked with all.
Andrea, can I ask you this one? Hiya. in the presentation, one of the pictures of the graffitis was a ship on the left.
Yeah.
The ship graffiti. And I'm very curious about if you have some information about these graffitis, especially about the ships. Medieval, post-medieval, in the churches, inside the churches. Can you give some information?
So there's a paper, the project I mentioned was between the 2014 and 2016, and it was the really extensively mapped all the islands searching for and mapping the graffiti. Stella Domestica is an archaeologist, so that was the intent to see the relationship and how the meaning of graffiti and everything related with the sea in that sense, and also learning about sheet building techniques. There's a couple of papers about the project. I think the most complete one is one about on the Journal of Nautical Archaeology 2017. There you can find the list, the general explanation, the methodology used is pretty complete. I'm not sure the database is finished or complete, but that one is, and you can have general lines and see also the meaning and how the team explained the
St. George of the Greeks has a lot of
yes, and against St. George of the Greeks
and nautical instruments. But also there's a very, very nice one on the wall of St. Nicholas in Nicosia. Have you seen that one?
St. Nicholas.
Mekastan.
Yes, you know, I think
Yes.
I don't know the one.
Yes, as you pass the main entrance, a bit further down, on the side wall, there is a beautiful ship, which I think is medieval. Okay.
Particular reason for
They were hoping they were praying so that they would come back.
like the actual sheep model they used to be an offering mostly.
May I make one general comment in defense of Camille Enlart? When we assess his views about whether it's about Cyprus, whether it's about the Byzantine monuments of Cyprus, or other such things, let's not forget what was available to him at the time. I mean, the monuments were in a terrible state. Most of the rural monuments, the churches, very little was known about them, about Byzantine architecture in general. I mean, by the 1890s, very little had been published. I mean, who would have had access to the publications of Choisy, for example, from several decades earlier, wouldn't have been very helpful for Cyprus. I mean, even the monuments of Byzantine Constantinople were hardly known by that point, at that point. So it's not surprising that he doesn't seem to know or be able to appreciate or to place them in any context. For Cyprus itself, I mean, he had access to the main late medieval and early modern historical accounts. I mean, he would have access to Macheras, there was already a French translation by that point. Maserati had done all the work on the sources, so that was easier for him to deal with. But the monuments would have been very difficult. And the frescoes, some of them barely visible under soot and all that, very difficult to appreciate at that point. So let's remember that before condemning him for his, at least his early views. Yeah.
And with this, I think, I'd like to thank the speakers, we'd like to thank the speakers for their wonderful presentations. I would like to thank every single one of you who made it up here today. The book, again, is going to be ready in about 10 days, 2 weeks. Feel free to leave your contacts outside for pre-orders. We would want to thank the whole team that worked very hard for the production of the book. We also want to thank the EA grants, EA Norway grants, and the Active Citizens Fund and Tassos Violaris Limited for the contribution, and the whole of the CVAR team. Thank you.